I know what you're thinking. Why do I have to attend classes? It's so annoying. My parents tell me to do it. My sponsors, everyone keeps on bothering me and saying attend classes. Is it really relevant for me? Now, in today's video, we'll be talking exactly about this conundrum. Should you attend classes? And if so, how do you get the most out of these classes? Now, if you recall from our previous videos, we talked about the ideal learning cycle. Within the learning cycle, we established steps that one needs to follow in order to become successful as a student. We talked about pre-reading, attending classes, post-reading, being able to attempt tutorials under exam conditions, evaluating and concluding whether or not you've grasped those concepts in the tutorials, consulting, and then ultimately teaching others. As you can see throughout the learning cycle, it's important to attend classes. It's one of the steps that you can't skip. Even empirically, if you go through the research and evaluate the top students, they all have one thing in common: being able to effectively attend classes and make most out of those sessions. So yes, to answer you, it is critical that you do go to classes. But now the question is, how do I get the most out of these classes? Now, in today's video, we'll be looking at 3 important factors that one needs to consider in order to be able to get the most out of their class. So the first one is pre-reading. Now, pre-reading is often underestimated, but it's the most important foundation if you want to be able to be effective in the classroom. Now, when you pre-read, you basically read the context of the material that will be covered in the class tomorrow briefly. And when I say briefly, I mean briefly, guys. 20 minutes at most. Trying to understand what the topic is about and getting a flavor or feel of what the lecturer will talk about in the session. Now, as you understand, when you pre-read, you get exposed to the information prior. This is important because we know that learning is 60% comprehension. That is, when we learn something new, we always try to relate it to a past experience first. So naturally, if you've done pre-reading effectively, when you get to the lecture room, you won't be flustered by all these new foreign terms and topics because you would have already obtained that understanding of these terms prior. So therefore, it makes you focused more in the classroom on the new topics or the important principles. So that's why pre-reading becomes critical in you becoming effective in the classroom. The second thing that you must understand is that you need to be able to answer 3 fundamental questions. Now, before we go into these questions, a lot of you might be asking me, but Kanti, I'm an introvert. How do I ask these questions? I'm so shy. So why bother telling me about these 3 questions that I need to ask in the class when I'm not going to even ask them? Well, I challenge you and say, listen, attending classes or asking questions is only an element of it. That is, when you become an active student, you are looking at 2 important interplaying principles. You are self-questioning and you're also questioning your lecturer or your practitioner who's delivering the content. The 2 go hand in hand. So it doesn't matter whether or not you can ask those questions externally to your lecturer. So long as you're questioning internally, you can still meet the objectives required. And that is important. But ultimately, regardless of what you're doing, it's always important to ask these questions. Now, what are these questions? Now, the first question that you need to ask yourself for every single principle introduced by the lecturer is, why is this principle important? Now, what you must understand, most of the principles, if not all of them, that are introduced for the first time to you in a lecture typically solve real life problems. Historically, it's most likely that academics did theoretical and empirical studies, and now because it has been established knowledge over a period of time, it then lands up in your textbook or your legislation that you are now learning. So therefore, there must have been a real life problem before the principle came about. So therefore, your job as a student is to draw the links or the parallels between the real life issue and the principle so that you can better relate to the experience. Now, it's also important to understand the why, because that's how human beings work. If you understand this famous quote, It doesn't matter what you say, but how you make me feel. We remember how people made us feel more than what they said to us. That is, as humans, we relate to experiences better than wording or verbiage. And that's an important part of the learning cycle. Once you start to appreciate the importance of simulating experiences within the learning process, you are in a better position to grasp those principles more easily. Once you've established the why and drawn the parallel links between the principle as well as the problem being solved, the next question that you need to ask yourself is what is the trigger that I need to look out for in the exam for me to know that this issue is being asked. Now, this is important. Let me provide an analogy for you to be able to see the importance of understanding the trigger. Suppose that you were going to the military and they were going to teach you how to be a soldier. Naturally, if you go to the military, they're going to teach you how to be a combatant, how to kill enemies, and how to literally use weapons so that you can be an effective soldier. I know that I might not be an expert in this topic, but please bear with me for a second. You are able to grasp the concept. The important element in my mind that you would need to know there is whether or not someone is an enemy or someone is a civilian. It's no good if you can't make the differentiation, because you might end up killing innocent people even if you are well trained in the knowledge of being a soldier. Once you understand the difference between the two, you can effectively apply your tools. The same applies to learning. If you cannot establish or understand where the principle is being applied or what the factors are that lead to the principle, it's useless to understand the trigger, because the trigger helps you to be able to pick up that it's time for me to apply this principle. That is why the majority of students are struggling in tested exams, because they get a large scenario, but they're unable to pick up the key points that are relevant, that are being asked, that relate to the topics that they've been taught in the lecture room. By understanding the trigger, and now the trigger could be anything. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a series of events. Whatever the trigger is, when you understand it clearly and simply from the lecture, you are then able to be positioned effectively to be able to identify it in a test and exam, so that you can be able to excel and know it's time to apply the principle. The third aspect, when you want to ask active questions as a lecturer, is that you need to understand how the topic interplays or how the principle is applied. Now, when you understand how the principle is applied, it's effectively you being able to appreciate how the principle is applied practically. Now, this is like the cherry on the top. Once you've understood why a principle is important and what the trigger is, you'll be naturally in a better position to understand how to apply it. Most of the work on how to apply a principle is usually undertaken when you perform your post-reading exercise. Now, when you perform your post-reading exercise with the necessary knowledge of why and what the trigger is, you're in a better position to cut your study time, because you'll be focused more when you read your textbook or the legislation on those key areas that are going to enhance your understanding, rather than reading the paragraphs without any context and wasting time. Now, the next question then becomes, once I've understood these three fundamental questions, are there any other areas that I can implement as a student to be effective in the class? And the answer is a resounding yes. There are other factors that we're going to cover now. One of the key factors is sleep. Sleep is often underestimated as a key tool to memory retention and being able to be effective in the class. What you must understand is that classes are inherently difficult, because you're going to be grasping concepts that are foreign to you for the first time. You need to be fresh and energetic so that you can be able to learn effectively. A tired mind is unlikely to ask the right type of questions to your lecturer, and therefore you won't get the benefit that is required for you to attend that class. Another important aspect is understanding non-verbal cues of your lecturers. Now, non-verbal cues are usually those hints that they typically bring across when they are introducing topics. You might find lecturers might heighten their voices when they're trying to emphasize something, or they might literally say to you, this is important. When those highlights come across, or those emphasis of matter come across, it's important for you to identify that and take note of it, because it's understanding those important areas early in the lecture that will help you when you do your post reading, so that you focus your learning on what is important for you to excel. Now, I've given you a lot of tools and tricks, but some of the questions that typically come about is, but Kandi, what if my lecturer is not good? What if they don't explain the why, the trigger, or the what, or effectively don't give those non-verbal cues? Does this mean I'm doomed for failure? No, you are not doomed for failure. What you must understand, or what the top students understand, is that it's irrelevant what the lecturer brings to the table. What your job as a student is to ask probing questions so that you can get the most out of your session. So if you ask the right questions, be it in a self-questioning manner or externally, either by asking the question explicitly during the class or during the lecture break or after the lecture, wherever you ask the questions, make sure that you have an answer to them. Therefore, when you have that answer, it won't matter if the lecturer didn't prepare for that class or didn't intend to go through that topic. You challenge them to answer that question, and that's typically good enough for you to get what you require from that lecture. Now, another important tool, and certainly not the least important, is being punctual. Being punctual is important because you want to get in early into the class so that you can get the maximum amount of benefit over the lecture time. Another important question that students often ask is, if I'm late, does that mean I should avoid going to class completely? And the answer there is no. You should still go to class regardless of how much time you're spending. What you then start to realize is that whether you're there for 5 minutes, 15 or longer, the fact that you're there is better than not being there, especially when you have the tools we've taught you today to ask the probing questions to get to the bottom of the matter. When you have the tools to ask these questions, you are then going to get that benefit regardless of whether you spend a minute or two in that lecture. So always try to attend wherever possible. Alright guys, I hope this video has been helpful to you, and now that you're in a better position to be able to become an effective student in the classroom. Remember that it's all about studying smart rather than studying hard. Until we meet again, all the best in your endeavors, and remember to give of your best and do well. Thanks everyone.